The air in the grand ballroom wasn't just thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. It was crackling with the electric tension of a story about to reach its climax, though no one knew it yet. For one man, Nathaniel Sterling, this was the pinnacle of his success, a night to be crowned king. For one woman, his ex-wife Catherine Vance, it was supposed to be a quiet night of professional obligation. But in a world of blinding spotlights and whispered gossip, a single microphone can become a weapon. And tonight, a weapon fired in arrogance would trigger an explosion of consequence that would bring an entire industry to its knees. The Apex Innovators Gala was the Oscars of the tech world, a self-congratulatory spectacle held in the cavernous ballroom of the St. Regis, New York. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto a sea of black ties and designer gowns. The clinking of champagne flutes was the evening's percussion, a constant rhythm beneath the murmur of billion-dollar deals and carefully curated pleasantries. Nathaniel Sterling swam through these waters like a shark. He was the CEO of Momentum Dynamics, a company that had, under his leadership, become the darling of the Ethelred global conglomerate. He was handsome in a severe corporate way, sharp jaw, meticulously styled, dark hair, and eyes that held the cold glint of perpetual calculation. On his arm was Brielle, a model, 2 decades his junior, a stunning accessory, whose laughter was as bright and empty as the flashbulbs that followed them. Tonight, Nathaniel was slated to receive the Innovator of the Year award. It was in his mind an inevitability, a confirmation of his genius. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, shaking hands, clapping backs, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He was a king in his court, and he savoured every moment of the adulation. Then he saw her. Catherine Vance stood near a marble pillar observing the spectacle with a quiet detachment. She wasn't dressed to compete. While other women wore vibrant silks and audacious sequins, Catherine wore a simple, impeccably tailored, navy blue gown that spoke of elegance, not extravagance. Her auburn hair was styled in a low, graceful chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of understated pearl earrings. She held a glass of sparkling water, a small island of calm in the churning ocean of egos. A flash of irritation crossed Nathaniel's face, a barely perceptible tightening around his mouth. He hadn't expected her to be here. Their divorce, finalized 2 years ago, had been acrimonious. He had painted her as the unsupportive, unambitious wife who couldn't keep up with his meteoric rise. In reality, she had been the co-architect of his early success, the strategist behind the curtain, whose contributions he had systematically erased from the corporate narrative. "Well, well," he said, steering Brielle toward her. His voice was a smooth, condescending purr. "Catherine, I must say I'm surprised to see you here. I didn't think this was your kind of scene." Brielle looked Catherine up and down, a flicker of dismissive curiosity in her eyes. "Nate, honey, who is this?" "This is Catherine," Nathaniel said, the emphasis on the past tense, hanging in the air. "My ex-wife." He gestured vaguely at her. "She runs what is it you call it? CAT, a little consulting firm now. Keeping busy, are we?" The insult was designed to sting, to frame her life's work as a trivial hobby. He knew exactly what Vance Strategic Solutions was. He just preferred his version of the story. Catherine's gaze was steady. She offered a polite, closed-lipped smile that didn't betray a hint of the fury that once would have consumed her. She had spent 2 years forging her emotions into steel. "Nathaniel, Brielle, it's a pleasure." Her voice was low and even, a stark contrast to his performative boom. "My firm advises on corporate restructuring and efficiency. It does keep me quite busy, thank you." "Restructuring," Nathaniel chuckled, sharing a look with a passing sycophant. "Sounds adorable. Well, don't let us keep you from your networking." He gave her a final, pitying look, as if she were a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. He then turned his back on her, a deliberate and public dismissal, and guided Brielle toward their table at the foot of the stage. The message was clear. You are in my world now, and you are nothing. Catherine watched him go, her knuckles white around her glass. The old wounds throbbed with a familiar ache. She remembered the nights spent mapping out business plans on their kitchen table plans, he later presented as his own. She remembered him calling her meticulous research overly cautious, and her brilliant insights cute ideas. He hadn't just left her, he had tried to dismantle her sense of self-worth, brick by painful brick. A waiter passed, and she placed her untouched glass on his tray. She took a deep, steadying breath, straightened her shoulders, and let her gaze sweep across the room. Nathaniel saw her as a ghost from his past, a footnote in his grand story. He had no idea she was the author of the next chapter. He thought she was here as a spectator. He was wrong. She was here for the kill. She wasn't just a guest. She was an invited VIP of the night's true power, the man who owned the entire chessboard, Alistair Finch, the formidable chairman of Ethelred Global. Her work wasn't just keeping her busy. It was about to change everything. The gala was just beginning, but for Nathaniel Sterling, the end was already in sight. The gala unfolded with choreographed precision. Salads were served, wine was poured, and a series of minor awards were distributed to polite, if unenthusiastic, applause. Nathaniel was a coiled spring of anticipation at his table. He held court, regaling his companions with anecdotes of his corporate conquests, while Brielle laughed on cue, her hand possessively on his arm. Every so often, his eyes would flick towards Catherine's table, a small, superior smile playing on his lips when he saw her sitting alone, speaking to no one. He interpreted her solitude as isolation, her poise as a brave face against irrelevance. Finally, the moment arrived. The host, a comedian whose jokes were as expensive as they were unfunny, boomed into the microphone. And now the award you've all been waiting for, the 2020 Apex Innovator of the Year, an award for vision, for disruption, for sheer unadulterated success. The winner is Mr. Nathaniel Sterling of Momentum Dynamics. The room erupted. Spotlights converged on Nathaniel's table as he rose, basking in the manufactured adoration. He kissed Brielle theatrically, a gesture for the cameras, and strode towards the stage with the confidence of a man who believes the world owes him its applause. He accepted the heavy stylized crystal trophy, holding it aloft like a conquered relic. Thank you. He began, his voice resonating with false humility. Thank you to the committee, to my incredible team at Momentum Dynamics, and of course, to the board of Ethelred Global for believing in our vision. He delivered the standard sanitized platitudes for the first minute. He thanked his engineers, his marketing department, his executive assistant. The crowd listened politely, but then a shift occurred. A sly, cruel light entered his eyes. He was about to go off script. You know, he said, leaning closer to the microphone, his tone becoming conspiratorial. True innovation requires sacrifice. It requires a relentless, almost monastic dedication. You have to be willing to shed everything that holds you back. You have to cut away the dead weight. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The tone had become personal. Some people, he continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing for a fraction of a second on Catherine, are content with the small life. They have small dreams. They start little projects, little hobbies to pass the time. And that's fine. It's nice. The word nice was delivered with such dripping condescension, it felt like an obscenity. But you cannot change the world from the safety of the shallow end. You cannot build an empire if you are afraid to get your hands dirty, if you are more concerned with balance than with victory. He didn't need to say her name. Everyone who mattered in their shared social and professional circle knew exactly who he was talking about. It was a public vivisection, a deliberate and calculated humiliation disguised as a motivational speech. He was branding her a failure on the biggest stage of his life, solidifying his narrative that he had triumphed by leaving her behind. The camera panned across the audience, and for a moment it rested on Catherine. She sat perfectly still, her expression a mask of serene neutrality. Inside, however, a storm raged. Each word was a sharpened stone hurled at the fragile edifice of composure she had so carefully constructed. He wasn't just mocking her business, he was mocking her very essence, her belief that success could be achieved with integrity and intellect rather than brute force and narcissism. She could feel the pitying stares of those around her, the whispered comments, the morbid curiosity. A slow, hot anger began to burn away the pain. An anger so cold and pure it felt like ice in her veins. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he couldn't see the tidal wave about to crash down on him. He thought this was his coronation. He had no idea it was his public execution. Nathaniel finished his speech with a final triumphant flourish. So to all the dreamers, I say this dream bigger. Bet on yourself, and never ever settle. The applause was thunderous, fueled by the raw drama he had injected into the evening. He walked off the stage, a conquering hero, and returned to his table, where Brielle embraced him with feverish pride. He glanced at Catherine one last time, a smirk of finality on his face. Checkmate, his eyes said. Catherine met his gaze across the room. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes held a new light, not of defeat, but of something far more dangerous. It was the quiet, patient look of a predator that has just watched its prey walk directly into a perfectly set trap. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, the gesture imbued with a chilling finality. The sting of his words was real, but the satisfaction of what was to come would be her balm. As the applause for Nathaniel died down, and the waiters began clearing the main course plates, Catherine remained a statue of composure. But behind her calm facade, her mind was a whirlwind, replaying not the humiliation of the last 5 minutes, but the calculated strategy of the last 18 months. The unraveling of their marriage had been a slow, insidious process. Nathaniel hadn't just cheated or left. He had gaslighted her into believing her own ambition was a flaw. She'd been the one with the MBA from Wharton, the one who saw the market gap for integrated, intuitive user interface software when he was still coding basic apps in their spare bedroom. Momentum Dynamics was born from her market analysis, her financial modeling, her strategic vision. He was the charismatic salesman, the face of the operation. She was the architect, the mind. In the beginning, they were a team, but as success grew, so did his ego. "We don't need to be that meticulous cat," he'd say, dismissing her detailed risk assessments. "You're overthinking it." Her contributions were slowly reframed as nagging her caution as fear. The final blow came when he secured the acquisition deal with Ethelred Global. In the final presentation to their board, he presented her entire 5-year strategic plan as his own singular vision. When she confronted him, he told her she was being emotional and needed to see the bigger picture, his picture. The divorce was his final act of erasure. He used his newfound wealth and power to secure a team of ruthless lawyers who painted her as a bitter woman seeking an undeserved slice of his empire. Exhausted and heartbroken, she'd accepted a settlement that was generous by normal standards, but insulting given her foundational role in the company. She walked away with enough capital to start over, and something far more valuable, a burning diamond-hard resolve. She founded Vance Strategic Solutions, from a small, leased office with a second-hand desk and a state-of-the-art computer. Her shingle was out, but she wasn't chasing just any client. She was targeting a very specific niche legacy, conglomerates struggling with innovation lag and inefficient subsidiary management. She built her reputation quietly project by project, delivering brutal but brilliant analyses that cut through corporate politics and delivered actionable, profit-driving results. Her name became a closely guarded secret in certain C-suites, a weapon to be deployed when a company needed to fix a deep structural problem. Her endgame, however, had always been Ethelred Global. She knew from the inside out that the conglomerate, while powerful, was a lumbering giant. Its tech division, propped up by the star performance of Momentum Dynamics, was riddled with redundancies and stagnant leadership in its other less glamorous subsidiaries. 16 months ago, she had leveraged a contact from her Wharton alumni network to secure a low-level meeting with a mid-tier manager in Ethelred's strategic oversight department. She presented a 10-page preliminary analysis, unsolicited, of the cross-subsidiary inefficiencies within their tech portfolio. It was so sharp, so insightful, that it was quietly escalated up the chain of command. 2 months later, she found herself in the top-floor office of the Ethelred Tower, sitting across a vast mahogany desk from Alistair Finch himself. Finch was a legend, a 70-year-old titan of industry with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being able to smell corporate rot from a mile away. He had her unsolicited report in his hands. "This is aggressive, Ms. Vance," he'd said, his voice a low gravel. "You've identified problems my own internal auditors have been too polite or too fearful to articulate. Politeness doesn't increase shareholder value, Mr. Finch," she had replied, her voice steady. That was the beginning. For the next year, Catherine and her small elite team worked under a strict non-disclosure agreement, becoming the ghost in Ethelred's machine. She was Finch's secret weapon. They analyzed everything: supply chains, R&D pipelines, personnel redundancies, and most importantly, leadership effectiveness. Her final report, delivered 2 months ago, was a masterpiece of corporate surgery. It detailed how the entire Ethelred Tech division could be streamlined, restructured, and reinvigorated, and it had a final explosive recommendation. The current head of the division was too old guard to implement the necessary changes. A new CEO for the entire division was required, one with vision, a deep understanding of the portfolio's strengths and weaknesses, and the grit to execute a difficult turnaround. And then she analyzed the division's star player, Nathaniel Sterling. Her report on Momentum Dynamics was scathingly objective. It praised the company's market position, but exposed its reliance on a single product line, its dangerously high burn rate, and a corporate culture that rewarded sycophants over innovators. She pointed out that its CEO, while a brilliant marketer, lacked the operational discipline for long-term sustainable growth. He was, her report concluded, a charismatic sprinter, not a strategic marathon runner. He was a risk to Ethelred's long-term stability. Alistair Finch had read the report, his face unreadable. "You've handed me a loaded gun, Ms. Vance," he'd said, "and you've pointed it at the man who is currently our media darling." "I was hired to find the truth, Mr. Finch, not to write fan fiction," she replied. A slow smile had spread across the old man's face. "Indeed. I have one final question. In your opinion, who would be the ideal candidate to lead this new division?" Catherine had leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "The ideal candidate would be someone who wrote the playbook for its turnaround. Someone who knows where everybody is buried because they drew the map to the cemetery. Someone who understands both the grand strategy and the granular details. Someone who is being consistently, fatally underestimated." She didn't have to say her own name. He already knew. Her presence here tonight at this specific table, seated alone, was no accident. It was a piece of theatre co-directed by her and Alistair Finch, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act. As the dessert plates were being set, a different kind of hush fell over the room. The boisterous energy from Nathaniel's speech dissipated, replaced by a more sober, respectful silence. The host returned to the stage, his tone now stripped of its earlier levity. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce a true titan of industry, a man whose vision has shaped the global economic landscape for over 4 decades. Please welcome the chairman of Ethelred Global, Mr. Alistair Finch." Alistair Finch moved toward the podium, not with the energetic stride of Nathaniel, but with the deliberate, inexorable gravity of a force of nature. He was tall and lean, his silver hair immaculate, his tailored suit a study in understated power. He didn't smile or wave. He simply occupied the stage and by his mere presence commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. Even Nathaniel, still flushed with his own victory, sat up straighter. Finch adjusted the microphone, the sound echoing slightly in the silent hall. He surveyed the audience, his piercing blue eyes seeming to make individual contact with everyone at once. "Good evening," he began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that needed no amplification. "We are here tonight to celebrate innovation. We've handed out trophies, we've applauded success, and that is important. But I am not here tonight to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Ethelred Global did not become what it is by resting on its laurels. We did not thrive by celebrating yesterday's victories. We survived and we lead because we are relentlessly focused on tomorrow, and tomorrow requires a new kind of leadership. Nathaniel listened with a self-satisfied air. He heard Finch's words as an affirmation of his own ethos, the one he had just espoused in his speech. He believed Finch was setting the stage to further praise him, to perhaps even hint at a larger role for him within the conglomerate. "For the past several months," Finch continued, "we have been engaged in a top-to-bottom strategic review of our most critical division, Ethelred Tech. We looked past the headlines. We ignored the hype. We dug into the fundamentals. We analyzed the data, the culture, the leadership, and the long-term strategic viability of every single component." At the mention of a strategic review, a nervous murmur rippled through the executives in the room. This was news to almost everyone. "Our review concluded that while we have pockets of excellence, we also have significant structural weaknesses. We have redundancies. We have stagnation. We have style over substance in places where we desperately need substance." His eyes, for a fleeting moment, seemed to sweep over Nathaniel's table. Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't going the way he expected. "To that end," Finch announced, his voice hardening with authority, "we are enacting a radical restructuring. Effective immediately, all of Ethelred's technology subsidiaries, including Momentum Dynamics, will be consolidated under a single newly formed operational entity, Ethelred Tech Division. This division will have a new mandate, a new structure, and new leadership." The room was now utterly silent. The air crackled. This was no longer an awards gala. It was a public execution of the old guard. Everyone understood the implication. A new divisional CEO meant a new supreme commander, a new kingmaker. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. The consolidation meant his fiefdom. Momentum Dynamics was no longer his private kingdom. He would report to someone else. His mind raced, calculating the odds. Who could it be? Someone from a rival company, an internal promotion from one of the other drabber subsidiaries he'd always disdained. The leader of this new division, Finch said, his voice dropping slightly, building the tension. Cannot be someone who is part of the old way of thinking. They cannot be someone who values applause more than results. They must be a proven strategist, a ruthless pragmatist, and a visionary who can see not just the next quarter, but the next decade. He let the silence hang for a beat, his gaze sweeping the room one last time before it settled with deliberate, unmistakable clarity on Catherine Vance. "We did not have to look far. The architect of this new strategy, the author of the very roadmap we intend to follow, is already in this room. She has been working with us in confidence for over a year. She has proven her brilliance, her integrity, and her courage." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He followed Finch's gaze and his eyes locked with Catherine's. In that instant, the entire world tilted on its axis. The condescending smirk, the pitying looks, the public humiliation he had inflicted upon her, it all flashed before his eyes, recast in the horrifying glow of his own epic miscalculation. It wasn't possible. It was a nightmare. Finch's voice boomed, sealing his fate. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to announce the new Chief Executive Officer of the Ethelred Tech Division, Ms. Catherine Vance. The name hung in the air, echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. For a full 3 seconds, nothing happened. No one breathed. No one moved. The collective shock was a physical presence, a thick, invisible blanket that smothered all sound. Then a single spotlight, as if guided by the hand of God, swung away from the stage and bathed Catherine's table in a brilliant, unforgiving white light. Nathaniel Sterling's face was a grotesque mask of disbelief. The colour had drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed horror. His eyes were wide, darting from Catherine to Alistair Finch, and back again, his mind refusing to process the reality of the words he had just heard. The heavy crystal trophy for Innovator of the Year sat on his table, suddenly looking like a cheap, gaudy paperweight. Brielle stared at him, then at Catherine, her perfect brow furrowed in utter confusion. The power dynamic, she understood, had just been violently inverted, and she was lost. From across the room, Catherine rose. She did not stumble or show any sign of surprise. She rose with a fluid, deliberate grace, a woman stepping into a role she had been preparing for her entire life. Her simple navy gown, which had seemed merely elegant before, now looked like a uniform of quiet, unassailable authority. As she began to walk towards the stage, the silence was broken by a smattering of tentative applause led by Alistair Finch himself. The applause quickly swelled, growing from a hesitant trickle into a roaring wave as the reality of the situation dawned on the audience. This wasn't just an announcement. It was a coup. It was a story. And they were witnessing its jaw-dropping conclusion. Catherine's walk was the longest of her life, each step of indication. She passed tables of stunned executives who had offered her polite, pitying smiles just an hour before. She saw the faces of people who had whispered behind her back after her divorce, siding with the obvious winner. Now they stared at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and frantic recalculation. Her path took her directly past Nathaniel's table. She did not look at him. She did not grant him the satisfaction or the torment of a single glance. Her focus was entirely on the stage, on the future. That single act of ignoring him was more devastating than any verbal retort she could ever have conceived. It relegated him to the periphery of her world, an obstacle already overcome, a detail already forgotten. She ascended the small set of stairs to the stage and shook Alistair Finch's outstretched hand. He gave her a paternal, approving nod. "The stage is yours, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Catherine stepped up to the podium, the same podium from which Nathaniel had mocked her very existence just 30 minutes earlier. The applause died down, and a new, more profound silence fell, one of rapt attention. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze calm and commanding. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she began, her voice crisp and clear, carrying to every corner of the vast hall without a tremor. "Thank you to the board of Ethelred Global for your trust and for this incredible opportunity." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Mr. Finch is correct. The future requires a new way of thinking. It requires a commitment not to fleeting praise, but to sustainable, long-term value. It demands integrity in our operations, accountability in our leadership, and a relentless pursuit of excellence in our products." Her speech was a masterclass in corporate precision. It was devoid of emotion, yet it was the most powerful statement of the night. She didn't mention her past. She didn't allude to Nathaniel's speech. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke about accountability and integrity was an indirect, devastating indictment of him. "The Ethelred Tech Division will be built on a foundation of strategic clarity and operational discipline," she continued. "We will empower our innovators, we will streamline our processes, and we will unlock the immense untapped potential within our portfolio. Our work begins on Monday. I expect to meet with the heads of every subsidiary in the coming days to outline the path forward. She looked directly toward the front tables, where the heads of the various tech companies, including Nathaniel, were seated. Her message was unambiguous. "You will answer to me. Thank you." She concluded her speech, lasting less than 2 minutes. It was all she needed. She stepped back from the podium as another wave of applause, this one genuine and thunderous, filled the room. Alistair Finch stood beside her, beaming. A photographer's flashbulb went off, capturing the image that would be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The next morning, Catherine Vance, the new CEO, poised and powerful at the podium, and in the blurred, out-of-focus background, the ghost-white, shattered face of her ex-husband, Nathaniel Sterling. The king was dead. Long live the queen. The moment Catherine stepped down from the stage, the carefully constructed social order of the gala shattered. The gravitational center of the room shifted instantly and violently. A swarm of people, executives, investors, journalists, and former fence-sitters surged towards her, their faces alight with newfound admiration. Hands were extended, business cards were proffered, and voices buzzed with urgent congratulations. "An incredible move, Ms. Vance. A brilliant strategy. So, but my team would love to get 30 minutes on your calendar next week." Catherine handled the onslaught with the same unshakable poise she had displayed all evening, accepting the congratulations with cool professionalism. She was no longer just Catherine. She was Ms. Vance, the most powerful new executive in the industry. Meanwhile, at the front table, a circle of emptiness formed around Nathaniel Sterling. It was as if he had become radioactive. His sycophants, who had been laughing at his jokes minutes earlier, now avoided his gaze, suddenly fascinated by their dessert forks or the architectural details of the ceiling. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water, and they were swimming away from the wounded. Brielle, who had built her identity around being attached to a winner, looked at him with a dawning, horrified realization. The man she had adored for his power and status was now publicly neutered. His currency was gone. She slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid her hand off his arm. The gesture was small, but the finality of it was absolute. Nathaniel sat frozen, his mind a chaotic vortex of rage, humiliation, and sheer panic. CEO of the Ethelred Tech division. It meant she wasn't just successful. It meant she was his boss. The woman whose ideas he had stolen, whose ambition he had ridiculed, whose very existence he had tried to erase, would now control his budget, his strategy, his future. The Innovator of the Year trophy on his table felt like a tombstone. He had to say something. He had to do something. Fueled by a desperate shredding of his ego, he stood up and started to move through the crowd towards Catherine. He pushed past a vice president and an analyst, his eyes locked on her. She was finishing a conversation with a senior banker when she saw him approaching. Her circle of new admirers parted, sensing a final dramatic confrontation. The ambient noise of the room seemed to fade away. "Catherine!" He hissed, his voice a choked whisper. He reached out his hand, about to touch her arm. She took a half step back, just enough to make his gesture pathetic and desperate. Her expression was not angry, not triumphant, not even pitying. It was neutral. It was the face a superior shows to a subordinate who is out of line. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and level, yet carrying the chill of an Arctic wind. The use of his formal surname was a deliberate, brutal power play. In that moment, she stripped away every vestige of their shared history, leaving only their new, starkly defined professional relationship. She checked the delicate watch on her wrist. "The celebration appears to be winding down. I have a great deal to prepare for over the weekend." She met his stunned, furious gaze. "We will speak on Monday. Please have your division's complete Q3 performance, analysis, burn rate projections, and a detailed staffing report on my desk by 9:00 a.m. sharp. I'll be scheduling your formal performance review shortly thereafter." She held his gaze for one more second, letting the cold, hard reality of his new circumstances sink in. Then, without another word, she turned her back on him and walked away, Alastair Finch falling into step beside her. Nathaniel Sterling was left standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, the crowd parting around him as if he were a leper. The sound of their whispers and the flash of a phone camera, capturing his utter desolation, were the only sounds he could hear. He had sought to humiliate her in a room full of their peers to make her small so he could feel big. Instead, he had orchestrated his own spectacular public demolition. Catherine didn't look back. As she walked through the grand lobby and out into the cool New York night, she felt no giddy rush of victory, no petty thrill of revenge. She felt something deeper, more profound. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of a meticulously executed plan. It was the feeling of her own worth reclaimed, not by luck or fate, but by her own intellect, resilience, and unwavering belief in herself. The past was finally where it belonged behind her. Before her lay an empire waiting to be commanded. The digital clock on the bedside table read 4:30 a.m. Outside Catherine's apartment, the New York City sky was still a deep, inky black, punctuated by the distant, sleepless lights of other towers. For most of her life, waking at this hour would have been a symptom of anxiety, a mind too restless to stay quiet. But this morning, as she opened her eyes before the alarm, there was no anxiety. There was only a profound and potent stillness, a clarity of purpose that felt as solid and real as the bed she lay in. The victory at the gala felt a lifetime away. It had been the thunderclap. Today was when the storm itself would make landfall. She moved through her morning routine with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark. A 20-minute session on her yoga mat, not for exercise, but for centering. A simple breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee consumed while reviewing a data summary on her tablet. A preliminary dive into the operational metrics of the 6 subsidiaries that now fell under her command. Her mind was already at work, identifying patterns, flagging anomalies, and constructing the chess moves for the day, the week, the quarter. Choosing her attire was a strategic decision. She bypassed the severe, dark pantsuits that were the unofficial uniform of many female executives trying to project authority in a man's world. Instead, she selected a cream-colored sheath dress with clean architectural lines paired with a sharply tailored blazer in a muted slate blue. The ensemble was feminine, but formidable, communicating confidence without resorting to cliché. It was the armor of a woman who had no need to imitate masculine power because she was busy defining her own. As she fastened a simple silver watch around her wrist, the only piece of jewelry she wore, she caught her reflection. The woman looking back was not the ghost of Nathaniel Sterling's past. She was not the wounded wife or the struggling entrepreneur. She was the CEO of the Ethelred Tech division. The title felt less like a prize and more like a mantle of immense responsibility. Alastair Finch hadn't just given her a job. He had placed a billion-dollar portfolio in her hands and trusted her to perform surgery on it. The personal history with Nathaniel was the catalyst, but the professional task at hand was now 1,000 times larger. The thought was sobering but exhilarating. Across town, in a penthouse apartment that felt more like a sterile art gallery than a home, Nathaniel Sterling was also awake. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night pacing the vast, cold marble floors, a glass of ludicrously expensive scotch in his hand, the Innovator of the Year award sitting on his bar like a golden skull. The hours after the gala had been a cascade of humiliations. Brielle had vanished before dessert was even cleared, leaving behind only a text message that was as brief as it was brutal. "I think it's best we take a break. This is all too much." His phone, which usually buzzed with fawning messages after a public appearance, had been eerily silent, save for a few terse formal emails from Ethelred's legal and HR departments, outlining the reporting structure changes. Rage had been the first stage. A volcanic, consuming fury at Catherine, at Finch, at the universe itself, for this betrayal. How dare they? After everything he had built, then came the frantic search for an escape route. He'd considered calling his contacts on the Ethelred board men he had schmoozed with on golf courses and at cocktail parties, but he knew with a sickening certainty that they would never cross Alistair Finch. Finch's power was absolute. Any appeal would be seen as weakness in subordination. He was trapped. Now, in the grey light of dawn, the rage and panic had curdled into something far worse, a cold, gnawing dread. The 9 a.m. deadline, the reports she had demanded, the very act of compiling them was an exercise in ritual submission. He, Nathaniel Sterling, the visionary, the rainmaker, had to package his own company's data like a junior analyst and hand-deliver it to the woman he had publicly scorned. He sat at his sleek, minimalist desk, the laptop screen glaring at him. He pulled up the financials, the staffing charts, the R&D burn rates. These were numbers he usually glossed over, leaving the tedious details to his CFO, while he focused on crafting the narrative selling the dream. But now looking at them, through Catherine's eyes, the eyes of a forensic strategist, he saw the vulnerabilities he had ignored. He saw the bloated budget for Project Nightingale, a speculative AI venture that was his personal pet project, staffed with expensive visionaries who had produced nothing but buzzwords for 2 years. He saw the declining margins on their core products, masked by aggressive marketing spends. The data didn't lie. His kingdom was a house of cards, and Catherine was the one who knew exactly which card to pull to make it all collapse. His hands, usually so steady when signing 9-figure deals, trembled slightly as he dragged the files into a single folder, labeling it Q3 Analysis, Momentum Dynamics. The simple act felt like signing his own death warrant. Catherine arrived at the Ethelred Tower at precisely 7:30 a.m. The morning shift of security guards, who had seen her coming and going for months as an anonymous consultant, now snapped to attention. The head of security, a burly man named Frank, stepped forward. "Good morning, Ms. Vance. Welcome." The deference was new, and it followed her across the polished granite floor of the lobby. Whispers trailed in her wake as employees recognized her from the news alerts that had blasted across the business world over the weekend. Her new office was on the 48th floor. It was a corner suite, vast and impersonal, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panorama of the city. The furniture was heavy dark mahogany, the relic of her predecessor, a man named Arthur Kensington, who had been gently but firmly pushed into retirement. The air was stale with the scent of old power. Catherine walked to the window, placing her hand on the cool glass. She wasn't admiring the view. She was assessing her territory. From here, she could see the distant office buildings that housed her subsidiaries. Her empire, an empire in disarray. Her new executive assistant, a man in his late 50s named Robert Connolly, arrived at 7:45. He was a veteran of the 48th floor, having served Mr. Kensington for over a decade. He was visibly nervous, holding a slim portfolio, unsure of what to expect from this new, unexpected leader. "Good morning, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a little tight. "I'm Robert Connolly. I've taken the liberty of preparing your schedule for the week based on Mr. Finch's transition notes. It's, of course, entirely flexible." "Thank you, Robert," Catherine said, turning from the window. She gave him a small, genuine smile that seemed to put him slightly at ease. "I appreciate you coming in early. First, please arrange for a design consultant to be here tomorrow. This office needs a complete overhaul. I want it to be a functional, collaborative workspace, not a museum. Glasslight modern. Get rid of all of this." She gestured to the heavy furniture. Robert blinked, surprised by the swiftness of her decision-making. "Yes, of course, Miss Vance. Second," she continued, her tone all business. "Please clear my schedule this morning until 10:00 a.m. I am expecting a meeting at 9. After that, please set up 1-hour introductory meetings with the heads of the other 5 subsidiaries starting this afternoon, and connect with IT. I want a direct, real-time data feed from every subsidiary's financial and operational dashboard integrated into my system by end of day. Yes, Ms. Vance, Robert said, scribbling furiously in his notepad. His nervousness was being replaced by a sense of professional respect. This was a leader who knew exactly what she wanted. That will be all for now, thank you, Robert. He nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Catherine sat down at the enormous mahogany desk. She didn't open her computer. She simply waited. The clock on the wall ticked with quiet, methodical purpose. 8:50, 8:55, 8:58. At exactly 8:59 a.m., there was a sharp knock on her door. "Come in," she said, her voice even. The door opened, and Nathaniel Sterling walked in. He was dressed in one of his signature bespoke suits, a uniform of defiance. But his face was pale and drawn, the skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones. He clutched a slim silver laptop and a leather-bound folder. He strode to her desk and placed the folder on its polished surface with a thud that was just a little too loud, a petty act of aggression. "The reports you requested," he said, his voice clipped. Catherine didn't look at the folder. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please sit down, Mr. Sterling." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, sinking into the leather chair. The vast desk between them felt like a battlefield. "Thank you for being punctual." She began, her tone maddeningly neutral. She swiveled her monitor slightly toward him. "I already have the raw data, of course, pulled from the Ethelred mainframe this morning. I was simply interested to see how you would package it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She had already seen everything. This wasn't a briefing, it was a cross-examination. She opened her own file, and a series of charts and graphs filled the screen. "Let's start with Project Nightingale," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your report describes it as a long-term strategic investment in next-generation AI. My data shows an 18-month expenditure of $42 million with no product milestones, met no IP filed, and a staff turnover of 60%. Can you explain the strategic justification for continuing to fund a project that is by every measurable metric a failure?" He was ready for this. He leaned forward, summoning his old charisma. "Catherine, Ms. Vance, you have to understand, true disruption doesn't follow a tidy spreadsheet. We're attracting the best minds in the field. It's about fostering a culture of innovation. You can't put a price on that." "I can actually," she countered, pointing to a different graph. "The price is a 30% budget overrun for the entire R&D department, which has directly led to a 9-month delay on the 2.0 update for our core product, Momentum OS, the single largest revenue generator in your portfolio. Your culture of innovation is cannibalizing the product that pays for it. That isn't innovation, Mr. Sterling. That is mismanagement." He recoiled as if struck. She was using his own business school lexicon against him, but with a precision he could never muster. "Let's move on to staffing," she said, clicking to a new screen. "Momentum Dynamics has the highest ratio of marketing and administrative staff to engineers of any subsidiary in the division. Why does your personal executive office require a staff of 6, including a brand strategist?" "My brand is crucial to the company's public perception," he retorted, his voice rising. "The company's perception should be built on the quality of its products, not the cult of personality of its CEO," she replied calmly. "Your travel and entertainment budget for the last quarter alone could have funded the entire starting salary of a new junior engineering team." She went on a surgeon, dissecting a diseased patient. She dismantled his arguments one by one, not with emotion or personal attacks, but with cold, irrefutable data. The charisma he had relied on his entire life was useless against the wall of her logic. He tried to bluster, to deflect, to charm, but each attempt was met with a quiet, factual rebuttal that left him exposed and foolish. The showman was being systematically disarmed by the strategist. He felt the sweat prickle on his brow. The power, the control, The very air in the room belonged to her. Finally, after 20 minutes of this clinical demolition, she leaned back in her chair. The picture this data paints, Mr. Sterling, is not of a thriving, innovative company. It's of a bloated, undisciplined entity, dangerously dependent on its founder's reputation and headed for a severe contraction if market conditions shift even slightly. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He was beaten. She let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. I am not going to fire you. That would be disruptive. For now. The implied threat was clear. Instead, you have a new mandate. You have 90 days to deliver a complete strategic realignment plan for momentum dynamics. It will include a 50% budget cut for all non-revenue generating projects, including the immediate termination of Project Nightingale. It will include a staff reduction of no less than 15% focused on administrative and marketing overhead. And it will outline a clear metrics-based path to doubling your operating margin within 18 months. Your discretionary budget is frozen effective immediately, pending my approval of that plan. You will provide me with a written progress report every Friday by 5:00 p.m., and we will meet every Monday morning at this time to review it. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. You built this company, Mr. Sterling. Now you will learn how to run it responsibly, under my supervision. She swiveled her monitor back to face her. That will be all. You may go. Nathaniel stood up on shaky legs. The arrogance, the defiance, the rage, it had all been burned away, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated man. He turned without a word and walked toward the door. The clicks of his expensive shoes on the hardwood floor sounded small and pathetic in the vast office. As he walked down the corridor of the 48th floor, he felt the eyes of the other executives and assistants on him. They knew. They could see it on his face. He was no longer the king. He was just another subordinate walking away from dressing down from the new boss. Back in her office, Catherine watched the door close. She didn't feel a surge of triumph. She didn't savor his defeat. She simply took a single deep breath, the first she felt she'd taken all morning. The weight on her shoulders settled immense and real. She had won the first battle, but the war for Ethelred Tech had just begun. She looked out at the sprawling city, at the empire she now commanded. Then she turned back to her desk, picked up the phone to call Robert, and began the work of her new day. There was no time to waste looking back. That night wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. Catherine Vance didn't just reclaim her dignity. She reclaimed the narrative that had been stolen from her, proving that true power isn't loud, arrogant, or dismissive. It's strategic, intelligent, and patient. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is not determined by someone else's opinion, especially the opinion of those who try to diminish you to elevate themselves. The ultimate victory lies not in stooping to their level, but in rising so far above it that they become an insignificant speck in your past. What would you have done in Catherine's position? How would you have handled that moment of public humiliation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
In the ruthless world of New York's elite, a public humiliation is a spectator sport. Richard Sterling thought he'd won the final round against his ex-wife, Catherine. He had the money, the power, and the dazzling new fiancée. He thought he'd left Catherine with nothing. But what happens when the woman you tried to erase doesn't cry? What if she just smiles, turns her back, and walks up the steps of a private jet that makes yours look like a toy? This is a story of how the quietest exit becomes the loudest statement of all. Stick around, the revenge is just getting started. The air in the Sotheby's auction room on York Avenue was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. It was a suffocating blend that Catherine Hayes had once found intoxicating. Now it just smelled of decay. She sat alone in the 10th row, a ghost in a simple, elegant navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the glittering peacocks preening around her. Her presence was a quiet rebellion. For 5 years, she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a name that opened every door in this city. Now she was just Catherine Hayes, and the only door she was interested in was the one marked Exit. Across the room, Richard was holding court. He wasn't just present, he was performing. His voice, a booming baritone she once found comforting, now grated on her nerves. He was flanked by his new fiancée, Isabella Rossi, a woman who looked like she had been sculpted from marble and draped in diamonds. Isabella was 26, a decade younger than Catherine, with the kind of effortless beauty that demanded attention. On her finger, a diamond the size of a small quail's egg caught the light, shooting out blinding white daggers. Richard made sure everyone saw it, his hand, protectively, possessively on Isabella's, turning it this way and that as he greeted acquaintances. He was a master of the subtle boast, the casual display of overwhelming wealth. Catherine focused on the catalogue in her lap. Lot 37, a collection of rare handwritten letters from Virginia Woolf to Vita Sackville West. They were intimate, raw, and beautiful, a conversation across time between two brilliant women. They had been her holy grail for years. During their marriage, Richard had scoffed at her dusty old papers, preferring to invest in art that screamed its value from the wall. He couldn't understand the quiet thrill of holding history in her hands. The bidding for the letters began. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't about Richard. This was for her. She raised her paddle. The numbers climbed, fast and furious. It was a duel between her and a man in the front row with a slicked-back ponytail. Finally, the ponytail man shook his head. The auctioneer's gaze fell on Catherine. "Sold," he was about to say, when a new voice, loud and clear, from the back of the room, cut through the tension. 200,000. Every head turned. It was Richard. He hadn't even been paying attention. He was looking directly at Catherine, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. Isabella giggled, a tinkling, artificial sound. Catherine's blood ran cold. He was doing this purely to spite her. He knew what these letters meant to her. It was a power play, a public humiliation. She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and raised her paddle again. 225,000. Richard laughed, a short, sharp bark. 300,000. The room was silent now, all pretense of polite chatter gone. It was a spectator sport, the ex-wife versus the new fiancé's champion. Catherine's savings could cover this, but it would be a stretch. This was no longer about the letters. It was about drawing a line in the sand. 350,000, she said, her voice betraying a slight tremble. Richard's smirk widened. He didn't even say the number. He just nodded to the auctioneer. The auctioneer, a man named David Abernathy, who had known them both for years, looked uncomfortable. 400,000 to Mr. Sterling. Catherine looked at Richard. He was a predator, toying with his prey. He was enjoying this. He wanted to see her break. He wanted her to retreat defeated. But as she met his gaze, she didn't feel defeated. She felt a strange sense of liberation. He could have the letters. He could have the victory. He was buying pieces of paper. She was buying her freedom. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head to the auctioneer. "Sold?" Abernathy's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed the breaking of the final invisible chain that had tied her to Richard Sterling. To Mr. Richard Sterling. A polite, scattered applause broke out. Richard leaned over and kissed Isabella, a long, theatrical kiss for the benefit of the audience. Catherine stood up. She didn't look at them. She turned and walked out of the auction room her back straight, her head held high. She didn't see the confused look on Richard's face as he watched her go. He had expected tears, a storming out. He had not expected this quiet, dignified retreat. He had won the battle, but as Catherine disappeared into the New York City crowds, he had the unsettling feeling that he had just lost the war. He held up his prize, the letters he didn't want, and for the first time felt the hollowness of his victory. The ghost had left the building, but her spectre remained a question mark hanging in the expensive air. 2 days later, the sky over Teterboro, New Jersey, was a brilliant cloudless blue. It was the kind of day that made the private jets lined up on the tarmac gleam like jewels. Catherine Hayes stood by the entrance to the signature flight support terminal, a single well-worn leather suitcase at her feet. She was dressed for travel in a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater and black trousers. She was flying to London for a book fair, a trip she had planned months ago, a celebration of her new, unencumbered life. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom purred to a stop a few feet away. The driver, a man in a crisp uniform, hurried to open the rear passenger door. Out stepped Richard Sterling, followed by Isabella, who was swathed in a fur coat that was utterly inappropriate for the mild autumn day. Richard's eyes scanned the area and landed on Catherine. He feigned surprise, a poorly acted charade that was almost insulting. "Catherine, what a coincidence!" he boomed, striding towards her. Isabella clinging to his arm. "Richard," Catherine said, her tone flat neutral. She didn't have the energy for his games today. "Off somewhere?" he asked, his gaze flicking to her single suitcase, a silent judgment on her modest luggage compared to the mountain of Louis Vuitton trunks being unloaded from his rolls. "London," she replied simply. "Ah, London. Business, I assume. Still playing with those dusty old books." He gestured vaguely, a dismissive wave of his hand. Before Catherine could answer, he pulled Isabella forward. "Darling, you remember my ex-wife, Catherine?" "Catherine, this is my fiancée, Isabella Rossi." "Of course," Isabella said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. She extended her left hand, not for a handshake, but to display the ring. The diamond, a flawless cushion-cut behemoth, was impossible to ignore. It was a weapon designed to blind and intimidate. "Richard has told me so much about you." "I'm sure he has," Catherine said, her eyes meeting Isabella's. She didn't look at the ring. This deliberate lack of acknowledgement was a small act of defiance, but it was hers. Richard, annoyed that his trump card was being ignored, pressed on. "We're off to St. Bart's for a few weeks, a little pre-wedding getaway, you know how it is. The stress of planning the wedding of the century, why, it takes its toll." He sighed, a theatrical display of the burdens of the ultra-wealthy. "Our jet is just being prepared." He pointed towards a large but slightly dated Bombardier Global Express. "You're flying commercial, I take it must be trying." The condescension was so thick, Catherine could have choked on it. She thought of the years she had endured this, the constant subtle digs, the psychological warfare designed to make her feel small, inadequate. She had absorbed it all, letting it chip away at her sense of self. But no more. "Something like that," she said, a faint, enigmatic smile touching her lips. Just then, a low hum grew into a powerful roar. An aircraft impossibly sleek and futuristic was taxiing towards their terminal. It was a Gulfstream G800, the latest and largest purpose-built private aircraft in the world. Its pearl-white fuselage shimmered in the sunlight, its wingtips raked back like a bird of prey. It made Richard's Bombardier look like a relic. The jet came to a graceful stop directly in front of them. The door opened, and a staircase descended with a silent hydraulic hiss. A flight attendant, in a sharp, tailored uniform appeared at the top of the stairs. "Ms. Hayes, we are ready for you." Catherine picked up her suitcase. She turned to Richard and Isabella. Their mouths were slightly agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. The triumphant smirk had vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a look of utter slack-jawed confusion. Isabella's grip on his arm had tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit. "It was interesting seeing you both," Catherine said. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable note of finality in it. "Have a wonderful time in St. Bart's." She walked towards the jet, her steps unhurried, her posture perfect. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel Richard's stunned gaze on her back, a silent testament to the seismic shift that had just occurred. As she ascended the stairs and disappeared into the cool, quiet interior of the G800, the door sealing shut behind her, Richard Sterling was left standing on the tarmac, the gaudy diamond on his fiancée's hand, suddenly looking small and insignificant under the shadow of the magnificent aircraft that had just swallowed his ex-wife whole. The ghost of his past had not only returned, she had upgraded, and he had no idea who he was up against. The interior of the Gulfstream G800 was a sanctuary of understated luxury. There was no gold-plated tackiness, no ostentatious displays of wealth that Richard would have insisted upon. Instead, the cabin was a symphony of soft grays, cream-colored leather, and dark-polished wood. It was spacious, quiet, and calming. As Catherine settled into a plush armchair, a sense of peace washed over her, a feeling she hadn't realized she had been missing for years. A man emerged from the forward cabin, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build that his impeccably tailored suit couldn't conceal. His hair was dark, with distinguished flecks of silver at the temples, and his eyes, a startlingly intelligent shade of blue, crinkled at the corners as he smiled at her. This was Julian Croft. "I saw that little drama on the tarmac," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "I almost sent the co-pilot out with a bucket of popcorn." He handed her a glass of water. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Catherine said, taking a sip. "I think I just shed the last 10 pounds of a very toxic marriage." Julian laughed, a genuine warm sound that filled the cabin. He took the seat opposite her. "Richard Sterling, I had my team do a little digging after you first mentioned him. A classic narcissist. All flash, no substance. His entire self-worth is tied to the perception of others. Men like that are incredibly fragile." "You have no idea," Catherine murmured, looking out the window as the jet began its powerful, smooth ascent. The world and her past shrank beneath them. She had met Julian Croft 6 months ago at a small independent bookstore in Greenwich Village. She had been reaching for a first edition of Mrs. Dalloway, and so had he. They had struck up a conversation, a real conversation, about books, art, and the quiet joys of a life lived outside the spotlight. He had introduced himself as Julian, a consultant. It was only weeks later, after a series of long dinners and walks through Central Park, that she discovered consultant was a massive understatement. Julian Croft was the founder and CEO of a global technology firm that specialized in data security and artificial intelligence. He was a billionaire, but he wore his wealth like a comfortable, well-worn coat, not a suit of armor like Richard. He was fiercely private, rarely photographed, and his name was more likely to be found in the footnotes of academic journals than in the gossip columns. He was flaunting his fiancée's ring, Catherine said, a small wry smile on her face. It was the size of a doorknob. And you? Julian said, his blue eyes twinkling, countered with a G800. A rather effective checkmate, I thought. It wasn't my intention, she said, though she couldn't deny the small, wicked thrill she had felt. But I'm not going to pretend it wasn't satisfying. Good, Julian said. You've spent too long diminishing yourself to make a small man feel big. That chapter is over. He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. How are the Virginia Woolf letters? Catherine's heart sank a little. He bought them. Outbid me at the Sotheby's auction. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. Julian was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. I see. He took a sip of his drink. Well, perhaps it's for the best. Sometimes you have to let go of old things to make room for the new. He changed the subject, steering the conversation towards the London Book Fair, asking her about the dealers she was excited to meet, the lectures she planned to attend. He listened, truly, listened, his attention focused entirely on her. It was this more than the private jet or the limitless resources at his disposal that was the true measure of the man. He saw her, the real her, the woman who loved dusty old books and quiet afternoons. With Richard, she had been an accessory, a beautiful object to be displayed. With Julian, she was a partner. As they flew east, chasing the sun, Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness. The turbulence of her past was finally smoothing out into clear, open skies. She was no longer a ghost at someone else's feast. She was the guest of honor at her own. She leaned her head back against the soft leather, the hum of the powerful engines, a lullaby of her new life. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt completely and utterly safe. The man in the jet was not just her billionaire boyfriend. He was her safe harbor, the quiet, steady anchor in the storm she had just escaped. And together, they were flying towards a future she was finally excited to embrace. Richard Sterling stood on the tarmac at Teterboro, long after the Gulfstream G800 had become a silver speck in the vast blue sky. The roar of its engines had been replaced by a ringing in his ears. The triumphant high from the auction, the smug satisfaction of flaunting his wealth, had evaporated, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. "Richard, darling, are we going?" Isabella's voice, usually a melodic purr, was sharp, impatient. The pre-wedding glow had been replaced by a pout. Her perfect St. Bart's vacation was being delayed. "What was that?" Richard muttered, not to her but to himself. "Whose jet was that?" "How should I know?" Isabella snapped, pulling her ridiculous fur coat tighter around her. "Does it matter? It's probably a rental. She's probably shacking up with some vulgar new money type to pay her bills." But Richard knew it wasn't a rental. He had seen the discreet custom logo on the tail fin, a stylized C intertwined with a J. That was a private insignia. That was ownership, and the G800, he knew what those cost. The base model was nearly $80 million. With custom interiors, you were pushing $100 million. That wasn't new money. That was a different stratosphere of wealth, a level that made his own considerable fortune feel pedestrian. The flight to St. Bart's was tense. Richard was silent, staring out the window, replaying the scene at the airfield over and over in his mind. Catherine's calm, her enigmatic smile, her complete and utter lack of intimidation. It was as if she was a different person. The quiet, accommodating woman he had divorced, the woman he had so easily crushed at the auction, was gone. In her place was this cool, confident stranger who boarded $100 million jets as if she were hailing a taxi. As soon as they landed and checked into their beachfront villa at the Eden Rock, Richard was on the phone. He called his PI, a former NYPD detective named Sal Moretti. "Sal, I need you to find something out for me," Richard said, pacing the marble floors of the villa. "A Gulfstream G800 tail number. I didn't get it, but it had a custom logo on the tail, a J and a C intertwined. A G800. That's a big bird, Richard. Not many of those around," Sal said. "What's this about?" "My ex-wife was on it." Richard said the words, tasting like ash. "Catherine, I thought she was, well, you know." "Yeah, well, apparently not," Richard grumbled. "Find out who owns it, and find out who she was with. I want a name, Sal. I want to know everything." The wait was agonizing. Richard tried to play the part of the doting fiancé, taking Isabella to designer boutiques in Gustavia and to dinner at Benito, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mystery of Catherine and her new life. Isabella, sensing his distraction, grew increasingly petulant. "Richard, are you even listening to me?" she complained over a plate of ridiculously expensive lobster. "I was talking about the seating chart for the wedding. We can't put my mother next to your Aunt Carol, not after the incident at the engagement party." "Fine, whatever you want, Isabella," he said, waving his hand dismissively as he checked his phone for the 10th time that hour. The call from Sal came 2 days later. Richard was sitting by the infinity pool, a cocktail sweating in his hand. "I have a name for you, Richard," Sal said, his voice grim. "But you're not going to like it." "Just tell me," Richard snapped. "The jet is registered to a shell corporation, but the beneficial owner is a man named Julian Croft." The name meant nothing to Richard. Julian Croft. Who the hell is Julian Croft? He's the founder and CEO of a company called Helios AI. They're a global tech firm. Data security, artificial intelligence, government contracts. He's very, very private. Almost a ghost. No social media, very few public photos. But he's significant. Significant. What does that mean? How much is he worth? This was the metric Richard understood. This was the language of his world. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, this guy isn't in your league. He's not even playing the same sport. We're talking about a net worth estimated to be north of $30 billion. With a B." The cocktail glass slipped from Richard's hand and shattered on the stone patio. $30 billion. The number was so vast, it was almost incomprehensible. It was a figure that turned his own $250 million net worth into pocket change. It was the kind of wealth that didn't just buy jets. It bought influence, power, silence. It was the kind of wealth that could make a man like Richard Sterling disappear without a trace. "Are you sure?" Richard whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm sure," Sal said, "and there's more. I looked into Croft's recent activities. He's a major philanthropist, but he does it all anonymously. A few months ago, one of his foundations made a significant acquisition in the world of rare books and manuscripts." A cold dread washed over Richard. What? What acquisition? He bought the entire archives of the Hogarth Press, the publishing house founded by Virginia and Leonard Woolf. The entire collection. Letters, manuscripts, first editions, everything. It was a private sale, very quiet. The seller was a small, struggling university press in England. Richard sank into a lounge chair, his head spinning. The letters. The Virginia Woolf letters he had bought at Sotheby's to humiliate Catherine. They were a drop in the ocean compared to what this man, this Julian Croft, had given her. Richard had bought her a page. Croft had bought her the entire library. The dusty old papers Richard had mocked were now the foundation of a collection curated by one of the world's richest men. Catherine hadn't lost at the auction. She had just been letting him win a meaningless skirmish while she was on her way to claiming an empire. He looked at Isabella, who was taking selfies by the pool, pouting her lips at her phone's camera. He looked at the diamond on her finger, the ring he had been so proud of. It suddenly looked cheap, garish, a desperate plea for attention. His world, so carefully constructed on a foundation of perceived superiority, was beginning to crack. And in those cracks, a terrifying, new reality was taking root. Catherine Hayes, his mousy, unassuming ex-wife, was now involved with a man who could buy and sell him 100 times over without even noticing. The unraveling of Richard Sterling had begun. The annual Conservation Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was the glittering apex of the New York social season. It was a night where fortunes were pledged, reputations were polished, and the city's intricate power dynamics were on full public display. For Richard Sterling, it had always been a home game, a night to reinforce his status at the center of this universe. This year, however, the universe seemed to have tilted on its axis. He and Isabella arrived in a flurry of camera flashes, Isabella in a Scarlett O'Hara-esque crimson gown that was designed to make an entrance. Richard, in a classic Tom Ford tuxedo, played his part, smiling for the cameras, his hand firmly planted on the small of Isabella's back. But his eyes were scanning the crowd, searching for a ghost. He didn't have to search for long. He saw her across the Great Hall, standing near the entrance to the Temple of Dendur. It was Catherine, and she was breathtaking. She was wearing a simple column-like gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated chignon, and her only jewelry was a pair of delicate diamond and sapphire earrings. She was talking to a small group of people, and as she laughed at something one of them said, the sound seemed to carry across the cavernous space a note of pure, unadulterated joy. Beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm, was Julian Croft. In person, he was even more imposing than Richard had imagined. He radiated a quiet intensity, a stillness that was more powerful than Richard's practiced bravado. He wasn't looking around the room, seeking approval or attention. His focus was entirely on Catherine. The whispers started almost immediately. "Is that Catherine Hayes? Who is she with? I've never seen him before." "That's Julian Croft, the Helios AI guy." "No, it can't be. He never comes to these things." "Well, he's here now, and he can't take his eyes off her." Richard watched as a procession of people he had considered his allies, his friends, made their way towards Catherine and Julian. People who had dropped Catherine from their guest lists the moment the divorce was announced. People who had sided with him, who had listened to his version of the story. Now, they were fawning over her, their smiles wide, their laughter a little too loud. He saw Jonathan and Beatrice Vance, a couple he had known for 20 years, practically elbow their way through the crowd to greet Catherine with effusive air kisses. Beatrice had once told Isabella that Catherine was a lovely girl, but a bit of a bore. Now she was hanging on Catherine's every word. The ultimate humiliation came when Richard and Isabella approached the main receiving line for the museum's director, Daniel Weiss. They were standing behind the Vances, who were now chatting animatedly with Catherine and Julian. As the line moved forward, Daniel Weiss greeted the Vances, then his eyes lit up as he saw the couple behind them. "Julian, I can't believe you made it," Weiss said, bypassing Richard completely to shake Julian's hand warmly. And Catherine, you look absolutely stunning. We were so thrilled when we heard about the endowment for the new manuscript wing. It's a game changer for us." Richard froze. The manuscript wing, he shot a look at Catherine. She met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was just a quiet confidence that was more unnerving than any overt display of victory. "Richard, Isabella, so good to see you," Weiss said, finally turning to them, his tone polite but noticeably cooler. The moment was fleeting, but in the shark-infested waters of Manhattan society, it was a mortal wound. They had been snubbed. Publicly, Isabella was seething. "What was that all about?" she hissed as they moved away from the receiving line. "A manuscript wing? Is that where her new boyfriend is parking his money? How utterly dull." But Richard knew it wasn't dull. It was strategic. It was a display of power that was both subtle and absolute. He wasn't just buying her jets. He was building her legacies. He was immortalizing her passion in the stone and glass of the world's most famous museum. What could Richard's diamond ring compete with that? Throughout the dinner, the humiliation continued. Their table, usually a prime spot near the stage, was in a less desirable location closer to the kitchens. From across the room, Richard could see Catherine and Julian seated at the director's table, flanked by senators, artists, and titans of industry. He watched as Julian leaned over and whispered something in Catherine's ear, making her laugh. The intimacy of the gesture was a knife in Richard's gut. He was losing. He was losing a game he hadn't even known he was playing. His wealth, his status, his beautiful fiancée, the pillars of his identity, were proving to be a house of cards in the face of Catherine's new reality. He had thought he had erased her, but instead she had been reborn stronger, more radiant, and powered by a force he could not comprehend or compete with. The whispers at the Met were a death knell for the world he had known. The ghost of his past was now the queen of the ball, and he was just a spectator in the cheap seats watching her coronation. The days following the Met Gala were a slow-motion nightmare for Richard Sterling. His world, once a glittering fortress of his own making, was being dismantled brick by brick. The story of his public snubbing had become a cautionary anecdote whispered over cocktails at the Bemelman's bar and dissected at lunches at La Goulou. Business associates who once clamored for his time now had secretaries who informed him they were in meetings indefinitely. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the edges of a world that no longer wanted him. His relationship with Isabella crumbled under the pressure. Her affection had been transactional, a currency exchanged for the status he provided. With his social capital plummeting, she had become openly contemptuous. The wedding planning devolved into a theater of cruelty. "Are you sure you can still afford the custom-built ice sculpture of two swans kissing?" she asked one evening, her voice dripping with venom as she browsed a bridal magazine. They were in their cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment, which suddenly felt less like a palace and more like a gilded cage. "Perhaps we should scale back. We don't want to look desperate. It's so unbecoming." The final fatal blow came 2 weeks after the gala. Richard was banking on a merger with a rival firm, a deal that would have been a lifeline, a public declaration that he was still a player. The CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, with whom he'd shared cigars and golfed for years, called him personally. "Rich, bad news," Marcus said, his voice strained with false sympathy. "The board's got cold feet, unforeseen market volatility." But Richard heard the truth in the silence between the words. Marcus's wife, a formidable woman who chaired 2 museum boards, had been at Daniel Weiss's table at the Met. She had witnessed his humiliation firsthand. It wasn't market volatility, it was social contagion. He was toxic. A black venomous rage began to boil in his gut. It was a potent cocktail of wounded pride, consuming jealousy, and a bizarre, twisted sense of ownership over the woman at the center of it all. Catherine. It was all her fault. He became obsessed. He had his PI Sal send him daily reports on her movements on Julian Croft. He learned that Croft had not only bought her the Hogarth Press archives, but had also established a fellowship in her name at Columbia University for the study of modernist literature. Each new detail was another twist of the knife. Driven by this corrosive fury, he did something he knew was reckless. He found out where she was living. It wasn't hard. The entire city was buzzing about the triplex penthouse Julian Croft had recently purchased at 220 Central Park South, the so-called billionaire's bunker. He went there on a Tuesday afternoon, a man on a mission of self-destruction. In the taxi ride downtown, he rehearsed his speech, a tirade of accusations and blame. When he arrived, he strode into the limestone-clad lobby, a place of hushed, intimidating wealth. The doorman, a man he would have once tipped $100 without a thought, regarded him with cool indifference. "I'm here to see Catherine Hayes," Richard announced, his voice a little too loud. "Is she expecting you, sir?" the doorman asked, not moving. "We're old friends." Richard bluffed the words, tasting like acid. He flashed a Patek Philippe watch like a badge of honor, but the doorman was unimpressed. Richard's name, it seemed, was no longer a key that opened all doors. He was forced to use a connection, calling a friend on the building's board to be allowed up. The humiliation of it stoked his rage even further. He rode the private elevator, its walls lined in brushed bronze, his heart pounding a frantic, angry rhythm. The ascent was silent smooth and felt like a journey to his own execution. When the doors opened directly into the apartment's foyer, he was momentarily stunned into silence. The space wasn't just large. It was a testament to a level of taste and wealth he'd only ever pretended to have. The marble floors were a seamless expanse of white, veined with subtle gray. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed Central Park like a living masterpiece. The art on the walls was quiet but significant, a small, pensive Rothko, a delicate Twombly. There was no gold, no glitz, none of the gaudy, look-at-me decor he favored. It was the home of someone who didn't need to shout about their money. And there, standing in a pool of afternoon sun, was Catherine. She was arranging a simple bouquet of white tulips in a vase, and she didn't look surprised to see him. She just looked weary. "Richard," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you shouldn't be here. I needed to talk to you, Tick," he snarled, striding into the room. "What is this, Catherine? What are you doing?" "I'm arranging flowers," she replied, her preternatural calmness infuriating him. "Don't play dumb with me," he exploded, his voice cracking. "This," he gestured wildly, his arm encompassing the whole panoramic view. "The jet, the gala, this palace in the sky. Who are you? You are my wife. You were a librarian's daughter from Ohio. I found you. I made you. You were perfectly happy with a book and a cup of tea." "I'm still that person, Richard," she said quietly, placing a final tulip in the vase. "You just never bothered to look closely enough to see the rest of me. You saw a reflection of yourself, and you were angry when I didn't match the image you'd created." "And him," Richard spat the word out. "This Julian Croft, you leave me, and you immediately find one of the richest men in the world. Is that what this was all about? Were you planning this all along? Playing the mousy little bookworm while you waited for a bigger fish?" Catherine finally put down her garden shears, and turned to face him fully. Her eyes, which he had once thought of as merely pretty, were now blazing with a cold fire he had never seen before. "No, Richard, that's your playbook, not mine. You're the one who equates a person's worth with their bank balance. I fell in love with a man who listened to me, who respected me, who saw me as an equal. His wealth is incidental. It's his character that I love." "Character?" Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think he has character, men? Like that don't get to where they are by being nice guys. They're sharks, Catherine, just like me." "You're wrong," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more chilling than a shout. "He's nothing like you." She took a step closer, and for the first time, Richard felt a flicker of actual fear. "And speaking of character, I think it's time we had an honest talk about yours." She walked over to a sleek minimalist desk and picked up a slim, leather-bound folder. "Julian's people, as you would call them, are very thorough. When he fell in love with me, he became concerned about you. Not as a rival, but as a threat. So they did a little digging into our marriage, into our finances." She opened the folder. "Do you remember the Sterling Opportunities Fund, the private investment fund you started during our last year together? The one you told me was too complicated for me to understand?" Richard's blood ran cold. "That's none of your business. It became my business when you forged my signature on the incorporation documents, making me a liable partner without my knowledge," Catherine said, her voice like ice. "It became my business when you used it as a shell to illegally hide marital assets from our divorce settlement. And it became my business, Richard, when you used it to commit insider trading based on confidential information you wheedled out of my father's oldest friend at the SEC, a dear man you knew I trusted implicitly." She slid a document across the polished surface of the desk. It was a copy of a wire transfer from the Sterling Opportunities Fund to an offshore account dated 2 days before a major corporate acquisition was announced. A transaction Richard had thought was buried under layers of corporate deceit. "This is a copy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The originals, along with a sworn affidavit from your former accountant, a man you fired without severance last year who was more than happy to talk, are with the SEC. They are very interested in your complicated fund. The merger you were so excited about, it didn't fall through because of market volatility. It fell through because Marcus Thorne was given a friendly, anonymous warning that he was about to merge with a man under active federal investigation." Richard stared at the paper, his world collapsing in on itself. The bravado, the anger, the jealousy, it all drained away, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He had been so focused on Catherine's new life, on the man she was with, that he had never considered that they might be looking back at him with a high-powered telescope. He had seen her as a ghost to be haunted, not a force to be reckoned with. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking the sound, pathetic even to his own ears. "Why are you doing this?" Catherine looked at him not with hatred, but with a kind of profound, sad finality. "You could have just let me go, Richard. You could have taken your petty victory at the auction and your new life and just walked away. But you couldn't. Your ego wouldn't allow it. You had to try and crush me one last time. You had to prove you were the winner. Well, congratulations. You've won. You've won an SEC investigation, the end of your engagement, and the complete and utter destruction of the reputation you worked so hard to build." She walked past him towards the window, overlooking the park, turning her back on him for the last time. "The doorman will show you out. Goodbye, Richard." He stood there for a long moment, a statue in the ruins of his own life, before turning and walking towards the elevator, a defeated man, finally truly understanding the meaning of the word loss. He had not just lost his wife, he had lost himself in the process. The confrontation was over, and there was no doubt who had emerged the victor. The Mediterranean sun was a warm liquid gold blanket on Catherine's skin. She was lying on a plush lounger on the deck of the Ataraxia Julian's magnificent 200-foot sailing yacht as it cut a silent, graceful path through the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. The name, she had learned, was the Greek philosophical term for a state of serene calmness, of being undisturbed by life's chaos. It was a perfect description of her life now. It had been 6 months since the confrontation in the penthouse, 6 months since Richard had walked out of her life and into the ruins of his own. The fallout had been swift and brutal, a public spectacle that Catherine had watched from a quiet distance. The SEC investigation had become front-page news, with the Wall Street Journal running a series of articles detailing the Sterling Opportunities Fund scandal. They painted a damning portrait of a man consumed by greed and arrogance. Isabella, in a move of breathtakingly predictable self-preservation, had fled the sinking ship. Her publicist issued a statement, dripping with faux sincerity, announcing the end of the engagement due to irreconcilable differences in personal ethics. The statement went on to detail Isabella's newfound commitment to philanthropic causes that support transparency and female empowerment. The last Catherine had heard Isabella was being photographed on the arm of a minor European royal with a storied title and notoriously empty pockets. She had traded one form of currency for another. Richard, stripped of his company, his fiancée, and his reputation, had been forced to sell his assets at fire sale prices to cover his legal fees and fines. The Bombardier jet, the Rolls-Royce, the Fifth Avenue apartment, all were gone, liquidated to pay for his hubris. He had retreated from public life, a disgraced footnote in the annals of New York society. Catherine felt no joy in his downfall, only a quiet, sad sense of inevitability. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and it had been washed away by a tide of his own making. Julian emerged from the cabin, a tray in his hands, bearing 2 glasses of chilled white wine and a small plate of figs and cheese. He sat down beside her, his presence a comforting warmth that had become the anchor of her world. "A message came through for you on the satellite comms," he said, handing her a glass. "From David Abernathy at Sotheby's." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I thought I was off his list of high-value clients." Julian's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Apparently you're back on it. It seems a certain collection of Virginia Woolf's letters to Vita Sackville West are back on the market. The previous owner defaulted on his payment." He let the statement hang in the warm air. "Abernathy was wondering if you were still interested. He said he could secure them for you privately before they go to auction again." Catherine stared out at the endless blue horizon. She thought about the letters, about the desperate hunger she had felt for them. She thought about the woman she had been in that auction room, feeling small and powerless, seeing those pages as a lifeline to a world of substance she felt denied. She thought about the sting of Richard's casual cruelty, and she realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the hunger was gone. "No," she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "Tell him thank you, but I'm not interested." Her passion for those letters had been a symptom of a deeper need, a need to connect with a life of the mind, a life of meaning that had been starved in her marriage. Now, she was living that life every day. She and Julian spent their evenings reading to each other, debating philosophy, and planning the curriculum for the new literary foundation they had endowed. The letters were a symbol of a craving that had now been satisfied. "I have the real thing now," she said, turning to him, her eyes shining. She leaned over and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss, filled with gratitude and a peace she had once thought unattainable. "I don't need to buy someone else's love letters." Julian smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." He gestured towards a small, leather-bound book on the table beside them, an object she hadn't noticed before. "Because I have something for you." Catherine picked it up. The leather was soft and worn, a deep navy blue. There was no title on the cover, only a small embossed C in the bottom corner. She opened it. Inside, on the first page, in elegant, familiar handwriting, were the words, "The collected thoughts of Julian Croft, on first meeting Catherine Hayes and thereafter." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and overwhelming emotion. "You wrote this?" "I started it the day we met in that bookstore," he said, a faint, endearing blush on his cheeks. "I jot down things after our conversations. It's a bit rambling, I'm afraid, and my penmanship is terrible, but it's all true." Her fingers, trembling slightly, turned the pages. It was filled with observations about her, quotes from books they had discussed, half-formed poems and heartfelt declarations of his growing love. One entry, dated a week after they met, read, "She speaks of books not as objects, but as old friends. Her passion isn't for the value of a first edition, but for the soul of the story within. She is the rarest thing I have ever encountered, a person who is entirely authentically herself." It was more intimate, more precious than any collection of famous letters could ever be. It was their history, their story written not for the world, but just for her. It was proof that she had been seen, truly seen, from the very beginning. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the ink on the page. But they were not the tears of sadness or humiliation she had once known so well. They were tears of pure, cleansing joy. The ghost of her past was finally completely gone. The auction, the ring, the drama, it all felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. She closed the book and held it to her chest as if it were the most valuable thing in the world, and to her, it was. She looked out at the endless expanse of the sea, at the horizon, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. It was a vista of infinite possibility. She had her own letters now, her own story, her own quiet, unshakable love. This was her new beginning, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have ever dared to imagine. In the end, this wasn't a story about the triumph of wealth over wealth. It was a story about the triumph of substance over flash, of character over reputation. Catherine Hayes didn't need a billionaire to save her. She needed to save herself, to remember the woman she was before the world told her who she should be. Julian Croft wasn't her rescuer. He was the partner she deserved, a man who valued her mind more than her appearance, her passion more than her pedigree. Richard Sterling's empire crumbled because it was built on ego and illusion. Catherine's new life is flourishing because it's built on the bedrock of authenticity, respect, and a love that is as deep and as real as the sea. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate revenge? Let us know in the comments below.